Shalom, welcome to Eretz Israel. I'm Avraham Shira. Erev Shabbat, there's something very important to notice that was brought to me today. Someone said, Shabbat comes and I don't want to smoke anymore. A cigarette smoker. And all Shabbat, I don't have the desire to smoke. And the minute Shabbat goes out, here comes the desire to light up. What's going on? Is it Shabbat? Is it the person's attitude? Is it a choice? What's going on that makes Shabbat different? They'll take away a guy who smokes 10 cigarettes a day and make him a guy who doesn't want to even smoke or doesn't think about it until, near the end of the day. So that's a question to hold in our mind, and we're going to look for an answer as we go. And other times people say, I wish Shabbat would never end. I just wish the whole week was Shabbat. And I said, there is a concept like that where you can keep Shabbat all the way until Tuesday, and you can take Shabbat on early, and you elevate time, but you have to live according to all these rules and customs that people generally don't keep during the 6 days of work. So there's that other feeling where you don't want to leave Shabbat. And of course, there's people that are like, oh, Shabbat's coming. Oh, there's so much hard work. I can't face it all. It's too much. And then I'm going to be bored on Shabbat, and I can't look on my phone, and I can't visit my friends because I can't drive, because I can't do this, and I can't go to the club. And so the people that have that attitude or that feeling towards Shabbat. When we talk about feeling the Shabbat, we're talking about a transcendental shift. We're talking about going up a level in consciousness. And that level in consciousness is reflected in a story from the Midrash that tells us when the Jewish people came out of Egypt. They had the big story of the sea, and they went through the desert, and they got the man, and God was really taking care of them, and they finally came to Mount Sinai, and they got the Torah. And when they got the Torah, they received 2 crowns. These crowns are like these little light bulbs on top of your head, right? Not exactly, but they represent in Kabbalah what are called the makifim, or transcendent intellect. A new level that you have yet to integrate into yourself, but it's a level that goes with you, and you can access it. And these transcendental intellects, we call them crowns because there's like a crown on your head, like a halo, in a medieval painting. Okay, so the Jews got the crown of Torah when they received the Torah at Mount Sinai, and they got the crown of Shabbat. And of course, there's those gifts, those transcendental gifts are given to us because we try to keep Shabbat, and we try to keep the Torah as best we can. Now, if a person is not used to keeping Shabbat, and then they say, I want to keep Shabbat, then they start to bring that crown back to them that was lost at Mount Sinai. What are you talking about? It's 3,400 years ago. No, the Zohar teaches us that all the crowns of Shabbat were lost when they served the golden calf. So where'd those crowns go? That bank account of light? Well, it went to Moses. And then, who is the master soul of the whole generation and of history itself, because Moses' soul reincarnates. It is the messianic soul that keeps coming back. And all that deposit of soul power was put into the soul of Moses, and every Friday afternoon, when a Jew keeps Shabbat, he gets back that Shabbat soul that he lost after the golden calf. Because we believe all of us were part of a giant collective, and we were there, and the giant collective then was spread out through the generations for these thousands of years. And then, the redemption is bringing all those souls back, but put that aside, these sparks of Shabbat were lost, put by Moses, and they were lost because they were part of the golden calf. And the problem back then was that if you didn't come out against the golden calf, you were implicitly guilty for being part of it. And that is a collective responsibility that the world has a hard time with. Why am I responsible for that guy's sin? Well, we're actually not responsible for his sin, but I'm responsible to say something nicely, very nicely, right? Please, you're going to hurt yourself and your family and generations to come by what you're doing. And this is usually found more in common practices today that we don't want to go into now, but where people actually do things that do destroy their lives and destroy their families, and you're trying to help them and they don't want to listen. What can you do? You're not responsible for people do things that are immoral and it destroys their life, but we're responsible to answer, to try to seek them out, to try to help them, to try to reach out to them. Okay, so if we don't reach out and we don't help, we don't try to be part of the good side of the equation, then, well, we get sucked into, so to speak, the negative. And that's what happened to all the Jews that didn't serve the golden calf, which most didn't. So this collective power called the soul of Shabbat was removed, and then it's given back every Friday afternoon. And how do you know that you got your Shabbat soul back? Well, this one example we just gave. That suddenly the desire to smoke, the habit, of course, is very powerful thing. It leaves you on Shabbat. And I know many, many people that they don't think about smoking on Shabbat. And we're not talking about just, tobacco. And that people will actually, for Shabbat, feel a lift of the urge to pick up whatever that thing is. And so that lift, why is it happening? Well, it's because the Shabbat soul has come back in. And the Shabbat soul is this transcendental light that expands your consciousness, that makes you not be such under the influence of the physical desires of this world. We get a download, if you will, of spiritual desires. Suddenly on Shabbat, I want to pray more. I want to, meditate more. I want to do some yoga. I want to learn some books I never get to learn. Whatever it might be. I enjoy sitting with my family because I don't have to run anywhere. And nobody's looking at their clock too much on Shabbat, and certainly not their phone. And so we have this focus, this spiritual focus that comes with this Shabbat soul. Now, if a person, let's say, is a person doesn't keep Shabbat, well, then that soul still stays in the account. They won't get the feeling of Shabbat. And the feeling, remember, is the absence of my workday policies, my workday urges, my workday practices, and all the other things that we do in a routine way. They all leave. On Shabbat, I don't think about what I have to do Sunday. It's over. The week is over. The world for me it's Shabbat now. And it's coming in, and then it'll leave. And on Saturday night, you feel it. You really feel the absence. So when we're talking about feeling Shabbat, we're talking about the absence of the physical world entering a material plane. A spiritual plane, from having left the material plane. Okay, so the person I was talking to said, well, how do I get that feeling for Shabbat? I said, well, okay, we'll start with some ideas. One of the ways is the mitzvah. It's a mitzvah of the rabbis gave us to la'arich et Shabbat, to lengthen the Shabbat, to take on Shabbat early and to leave Shabbat late. So that actually shows extra love for Shabbat. And when you show your devotion to Shabbat, then Shabbat shows you devotion. So that what happens is when you lengthen Shabbat, before Shabbat, then guess what? After Shabbat, you want to stay there. Where am I going that I need to leave Shabbat Saturday night? What do I have to do that's so important that I want to break up the party, break up the third meal that we have, to do what? To check my phone, to see the news, to see what bad stuff happened in the world? Is that why I want to leave this blessed space and time? So that's one way, is extending the Shabbat extends your relationship to Shabbat. It expands the connection. Another way, of course, the Ben Ish Chai says very mundane things. He says, Rabbi Yosef Chaim, he says, don't take off your Shabbos clothes till the midnight. Okay, that's practical considerations are involved in that, but all things equal, you can keep on your Shabbat clothes to the middle of the night. That extends the light of Shabbat that's attached to your clothing. Because when you say your shirt, your kippah, your robe, whatever you wear on Shabbat is your Shabbat robe, it has special significance. You don't wear it during the week. That significance is called appointing the garment to Shabbat adds holiness to it. Just like your candlesticks that you use for Shabbat. They become holy because you make them that. See, we're not used to the consciousness that I actually have the power to make something holy by separating it. But that's what we do. Same thing with money, same thing with other articles that we have in our house. So when you extend Shabbat by your clothes, you also extend the feeling of that specialness, that time and place above time and place. Now, we also have special Shabbat food. There are rabbis that I read about that they would only eat Shabbat food all week long. And, I don't know how their leftovers were. I don't have a problem with leftovers, and I'll eat Shabbat food into the week as long as it's, it doesn't, it doesn't change colors. But the idea still is that food is sanctified by Shabbat, and therefore if you eat it during the week, you're eating sanctified food. On Sunday, on Monday, however long your porridge lasts. Now, so what we're doing is we're stretching the holiness in time and space, and that expands it beyond us. And so another way it tells us in the Talmud that Shammai, the great rabbi of the first century, every day he went to the market, he would buy something for Shabbat. And if he found something better, he would replace the better thing with the lesser thing. So if he got a little fish on Sunday and he found a big, nice fish on Wednesday or Thursday, he'd replace them. And he constantly was adding to his Shabbat by buying more things. So there you have another relationship to food that gets expanded, and the holiness comes on that thing. And so each day of the week, you're dragging Shabbat into the weekday. That changes your weekday. Just to remember Shabbat during the week. Just to remember, what day is today? It's Tuesday. Only 3 more days till Shabbat starts. Wow. And so you begin to transform your relationship to this world through the consciousness of Shabbat. And that's very big, because what are we waiting for? If not the 7,000th year, right? The 1,000 years of Shabbat, which are promised to us by the sages. And why not? How long are we going to put up with this world, right? Now, so again, the idea of how do we recognize the Shabbat and feel it is oftentimes by the absence of things that we're used to that no longer stay stuck to us on the Shabbat itself. Another thing that we can do on Shabbat is we sing songs that we wouldn't normally sing. We learn books that we don't normally learn. And we also refrain from speech that we normally do engage in. So on Shabbat, we'll try not to talk about business. And even politics, which is like very hard for a lot of people not to talk about, is politics. Politics is considered still the things of this world. Now you could say, well, if it's politics of the Jewish people or politics of the Jewish state, it is more closer to our heart, but it doesn't mean that it's going to keep us attached to the holiness. Because the idea is that my mind is attached to something greater than the here and the now that we experience daily. And that includes what politicians are doing. Okay? Because believe it or not, politicians are actually just people that have a desk somewhere and they answer the phone, or they have other people answer the phone. But the point is that what politicians are doing really on Shabbat doesn't matter. What matters is afterwards. Now, this whole mindset shift is how we keep the Shabbat with us. And that's how we reintegrate the crown that was lost at Mount Sinai. And week after week after week, it becomes part of you until you really do see that you change. And that change is fundamental. And it's why I call it the tiny, tremendous shift or transition, is because if you do it enough, it's tiny. The absence of wanting to do things that I don't do on Shabbat, like throwing out old fruit from the basket, It's not something we do on Shabbat. We take the fruit we want, but we don't throw out the old, right, on Shabbat. Because that's called borer. That's called separating good and evil. And on Shabbat, it's all good. So we don't separate good and evil on a day that's called all good. So that activity is something we don't do on Shabbat. So, but what you'll find is that you won't even think about it. And sometimes you will. I notice also sometimes if I'm working on Friday afternoon or trying to finish something up, and then on Shabbat comes in and I'm still starting to think about, that garage door. What am I going to do with that? No, that's where I have to stop myself and say, that's where the weekdays is starting to impinge and come into the holy day. So, there's a certain amount of watchfulness, a certain amount of mindfulness we need to carry into Shabbat. But when we connect it to your whole week, then your whole week starts to get more buoyant. We don't get stuck in the depth of this world so much, because we know the last Shabbat is still with us and the new Shabbat is coming, and we're going to drag that energy into all time and space until ultimately that's what the Messianic era is all about, is where humanity rises to a level that they had before in the garden, where we didn't have to toil and sweat and suffer this world. So it's a very pleasant fantasy, you could call it. You could call it a dream. You could call it also a promise. And whatever you call it, your relationship to it will help frame it. As the Talmud says, a person who says there is no world to come is right. For them, they're right. There is no world to come, because that's what they believe. And a person who believes in the world to come, their belief makes it true. And God gives us that latitude of spiritual power and influence, metaphysical power, to choose what you want to be your truth. But you have to take responsibility for your choice. So, a long time ago, I said, I think these old rabbis know more than I do. I'm going to go with them. And as you start to put together all the pieces of Torah that you learn, and the Kabbalah promises and the chassidut, and everything comes together, you start to see, wow, it's not so esoteric and far from us. It's really very practical and grounded. And that's what we want to do, is demystify the mystical and bring it down to here and now, because that's where we are. And that's where God wants to be with us. So may God be with you, and have a wonderful Shabbat. And we'll see you next week on all the platforms. Shabbat Shalom.